The sky burned orange and red like the inside of a furnace, and the ground beneath young Kyrith's claws was so hot that it blistered his scales with every step he took. He had been walking for 3 days now, or maybe it was 4, because time had become a blur of heat and thirst and the endless stretch of volcanic rock that seemed to go on forever in every direction. Kyrith was 12 cycles old, which made him barely more than a hatchling by the standards of his people, the Drakethuri. And he had never felt so alone in his entire life. The ember wastes stretched around him like a punishment from the old gods, and he could not remember why he had thought he could cross them by himself. But then the memories came flooding back, as they always did when he tried to forget. The slavers had come at dawn 3 days ago, their ships descending on the caravan like metal birds of prey, and Kyrith's mother had grabbed him by the arm and thrown him into the ravine before he could even scream. He remembered the sound of plasma fire, and he remembered his mother's voice telling him to run and never look back. And he remembered the silence that followed that was somehow worse than all the screaming. So he had run, just like he told him to. And he had kept running until his legs gave out, and then he had crawled. And now he was dying in this wasteland because there was no water anywhere, and his body was shutting down piece by piece. The Drakethuri were a proud species, known throughout the galaxy for their shimmering scales that sparkled like precious gems and for the fire that burned in their throats. But Kyrith did not feel proud right now. His scales, which should have been the deep blue of a sapphire ocean, had turned gray and dull and cracked like old pottery left too long in the sun. His fire glands, which should have been able to produce a flame hot enough to melt steel, had gone cold and empty because fire needed fuel and fuel needed water, and he had none of either. He was going to die out here, and nobody would ever know what happened to him. And his mother's sacrifice would mean nothing at all. That thought hurt worse than the thirst. Kyrith stumbled and fell, his knees hitting the hot ground hard enough to make him cry out, though no tears came because his body had no moisture left to spare for something as useless as crying. He tried to push himself back up, but his arms were shaking too badly, and after a moment he just gave up and lay there on the burning rock, waiting for the end to come. That was when he saw the figure on the ridge above him. At first Karath thought it was a hallucination, because the heat did strange things to your eyes out here in the wastes, and he had been seeing things that were not real for the past day or so. But this figure did not shimmer and fade like the others had, and as Karath squinted against the brutal light of the twin suns, he realized with a jolt of fear that the figure was real, and it was coming toward him. The shape was wrong for a Drakethuri, too short and too soft, with no tail and no horns and no wings folded against its back. It took Kyrith's heat-addled brain a long moment to understand what he was looking at. And when he finally did understand, his fear grew 10 times worse. It was a human. Every child in the galaxy knew about humans, and none of the stories were comforting ones to hear before sleep. They were a young species, barely a few thousand years into their journey among the stars, but they had already made a name for themselves that echoed through every corner of known space. They were relentless, the story said, and they were unpredictable. And they were dangerous in ways that made even the ancient warrior races of the galaxy nervous. The Drakethuri elders spoke of humans in careful tones, the way you might speak of a natural disaster that could strike at any moment without warning. They were not evil exactly, the elders said, but they were something perhaps more frightening than evil, because you could never quite predict what they would do next. Some humans had been known to show great kindness to strangers, while others had burned entire worlds for reasons no one could understand. They were chaos wrapped in soft skin, and the smart thing to do when you met one was to run away as fast as your legs could carry you. But Kyrith could not run. He could barely lift his head from the ground as the human descended the rocky slope toward him. moving with a confidence that suggested the brutal heat did not bother it nearly as much as it should have. The human was wearing some kind of environmental suit, though the helmet was off and hanging from a clip at its belt, and Kirith could see its face clearly as it approached. It was a strange face, flat and furless, with small eyes that seemed to be studying him with an expression Kirith could not read. The human stopped a few feet away from where Kirith lay, and for a long moment neither of them moved or spoke. Kirith's hearts were pounding so hard he could hear them in his ears, and he wondered if the human was deciding whether to help him or simply leave him here to die, or worse. He thought with a spike of terror, maybe this human was one of the bad ones, and it would do something terrible to him before the end came. He tried to push himself up again, some desperate instinct telling him to at least face his fate on his feet like a proper Drekthuri. But his arms gave out immediately, and he collapsed back to the ground with a pathetic whimper. The human took another step forward, and Kirith flinched away, raising one clawed hand to shield his face, even though he knew it would do no good against a creature that had conquered half the galaxy through sheer stubborn refusal to die. "Please," he heard himself say, his voice coming out as a dry croak that barely sounded like words at all. "Please, I am not a threat to you. I am just a child. Please do not hurt me." The human stopped moving, and its strange flat face changed in some way that Kirith could not interpret, and it reached for something at its belt. Kirith closed his eyes and waited for the end to come. Sergeant Elena Vasquez had seen a lot of strange things during her 15 years of service with the Colonial Survey Corps, but a dying dragon child in the middle of the Ember Wastes was definitely a new one. She had been out here for 3 days now, scanning for mineral deposits that the mining companies might want to exploit, and she had expected to find nothing but rocks, and heat and the occasional volcanic vent spewing toxic gases into the orange sky. What she had not expected was for her scanner to pick up a life sign that was clearly not local wildlife and clearly not one of the patrol units from the garrison 30 kilometers to the east. The signal had been weak and getting weaker, which meant whatever it was would be dead soon if nobody helped it. And Elena had never been the kind of person who could just walk away from something like that, so she had changed course and followed the signal over 2 ridges and down into a valley that looked like something out of a nightmare about hell. And that was where she had found him. He was just a kid. That was the first thing she noticed. And the second thing she noticed was that he was in very bad shape. Indeed, Elena had met Drekthuri before, and she knew they were supposed to be magnificent creatures, with scales that shimmered like jewels and eyes that burned with inner fire. But this one looked like a piece of dried leather that someone had left out in the sun too long. His scales were gray and cracked and peeling away in places, and his eyes were dull and unfocused. And when he tried to push himself up off the ground, his arms shook so badly that he collapsed again almost immediately. He was afraid of her. She could see that clearly, and she supposed she could not blame him for that, because humans did not exactly have the best reputation in this part of the galaxy. When she stepped forward to get a better look at him, he flinched away and raised a clawed hand to protect his face. And the fear in his eyes was so raw and desperate that it made her chest hurt. "Please," he croaked out in broken common, his voice so dry it sounded like sandpaper rubbing against stone. "Please, I am not a threat to you. I am just a child. Please do not hurt me." Elena stopped moving and felt her heart crack a little bit at the sound of those words. She reached for her belt, moving slowly so as not to frighten him any further, and her fingers closed around the canteen that hung there in its familiar spot. The boy closed his eyes like he was waiting for her to kill him, and that made her chest hurt even more. "Hey," she said softly, keeping her voice as gentle as she could manage. "Hey kid, open your eyes. I am not going to hurt you." The boy opened his eyes slowly, and she could see the confusion in them mixing with the fear. Like he could not quite believe what he was hearing. "I'm going to come closer now," Elena said, still keeping her voice soft and calm. "I have something you need, and I want to give it to you, okay?" She knelt down next to him, ignoring the heat of the rock that immediately began seeping through her suit's knee padding. And she held up the canteen so he could see it. The boy's eyes went wide, and she watched his cracked lips part slightly as he stared at the container like it was made of solid gold water. She said, and the word came out sounding almost holy somehow. "I have water, and you need it. So I'm going to give you some." The boy swallowed hard, or tried to anyway. And when he spoke, his voice was barely louder than a whisper. "Please, sir," he said. And Elena did not bother to correct him about the sir part, because it really did not matter right now. "Please, sir, just one sip of water, I beg you. Just one sip, and I will be in your debt forever." He paused and seemed to gather his strength before continuing. "My clan will pay you back," he said. "When they find me, they will pay you whatever you ask. I swear it on my mother's honor. Just please, one sip. I am begging you." Elena looked at the canteen in her hand and did some quick math in her head. It was a standard issue container, nothing fancy, designed to hold enough water for 3 days of normal activity in hot conditions, or 2 days, if you were really pushing yourself hard. The garrison was 30 kilometers to the east, and she could make it there in about a day and a half if she traveled at night when the temperature dropped and rested, during the worst of the daytime heat that would leave her with maybe half a day's worth of water to spare if everything went perfectly, which of course nothing ever did. But the kid would need at least a full day's worth of water just to get back on his feet, and probably more than that if he was going to make the journey to the garrison with her. If she gave him what he needed, she would be running on almost nothing. And the math got very ugly very quickly when you started calculating survival odds in a place like this. Elena looked at the canteen, and then she looked at the boy's cracked scales and dull eyes and trembling hands. And she thought about her own daughter back home, who was just a few years younger than this kid seemed to be. She thought about what she would want a stranger to do if her daughter was the one dying of thirst in some alien desert. The math did not matter after that. Elena unscrewed the cap from the canteen and held the entire thing out toward the boy. "Handle first so he could take it easily. Here," she said. "Take it." The boy stared at her like she had just grown a second head. "One sip," he said again, like maybe she had not understood him the first time. "I asked for one sip, sir." "I heard you," Elena said, and she pushed the canteen a little closer to him. "Drink slow or you will cramp up, small sips at a time. But it is all yours." The boy's clawed hands were shaking as he reached out and took the canteen from her, and she could see the confusion written all over his strange dragon face. "But this is all of it," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "This is everything you have." "Yeah," Elena said, and she sat back on her heels and smiled at him. "I know. You will die," the boy said, and he sounded almost angry about it somehow, like she was doing something incredibly stupid, and he could not understand why. Elena shrugged, which was not easy to do while kneeling on hot rocks in an environmental suit. "Probably not," she said. "I am pretty stubborn. It is kind of a species trait if you have not heard." The boy was still staring at her, the canteen clutched in his hands like he was afraid she might change her mind and take it back. "Why?" he asked, and the word came out like it had been torn from somewhere deep inside him. "Why would you do this?" Elena thought about that question for a moment, because it seemed like the kid really wanted an answer and not just some throwaway line about human kindness or whatever. "Because you are a kid," she said finally. "And because you needed it, and because I could give it to you." She paused and tilted her head slightly. "Is that not enough?" The boy did not answer, but after a long moment, He raised the canteen to his cracked lips and took a small sip of water. And the look on his face was like someone who had just been given the entire universe. As a gift, Elena watched him drink and smiled to herself. And she did not regret her decision even a little bit. The math could go to hell. She thought some things were more important than math. Kirith could not understand what was happening. And the more he tried to make sense of it, the more confused he became. He was sitting up now, which was something he had not been able to do an hour ago. And the canteen in his hands was still half full, because the human woman had kept reminding him to drink slowly and take breaks between sips. The water was warm and tasted like metal, and it was the most wonderful thing Kirith had ever put in his mouth in his entire 12 cycles of life. But that was not the confusing part. The confusing part was the human, sitting across from him on a flat rock, checking some kind of device on her wrist and occasionally looking up at the sky like she was calculating something important. She had given him everything she had, every drop of water that stood between her and death in this terrible place, and she had done it like it was nothing, like it was the most natural thing in the world. That was not how things worked. At least not in any world that Kirith had ever known among the Drakthari. Everything had a price, and every gift came with strings attached that would eventually need to be pulled. You did not give without expecting to receive. And he did not offer help without negotiating the terms of repayment first. Because that was how civilized people behaved. His mother had taught him that before he could even breathe fire. And her mother had taught her, and so on, going back for 1,000 generations to the very first Drakthari, who had learned that the universe was a place of transactions and nothing more. But this human had not asked for anything. She had not demanded payment or made him sign a contract, or even asked for his name before handing over the canteen. That might very well have been her own life. Kirith took another small sip of water and tried to find the words to express the chaos that was happening inside his head. "I do not understand," he said finally. And the human looked up from her device with that strange flat face that was so hard to read. "I do not understand why you did this." The human, who had told him her name was Elena, though he was not sure he was pronouncing it correctly, tilted her head in a way that reminded Kirith of a curious bird. "I told you why," she said. "Because you needed it and because I could help." "But that is not a reason," Kirith said. And he could hear the frustration creeping into his own voice. "That is not how the universe works. You can't just give things away without getting something in return." Elena was quiet for a moment, and then she did something with her mouth that showed her teeth, which Kirith had been taught was a sign of aggression, but somehow did not feel aggressive at all. "That is called a smile," Elena said, like she could tell what he was thinking. "It means I'm happy or amused. Not that I want to bite you." "Oh," Kirith said. And he filed that information away for later because it seemed important. "And you are wrong," Elena continued. "About the universe, I mean. You can absolutely give things away without getting something back. Humans do it all the time." "But why?" Kirith asked again. Because he genuinely could not wrap his mind around the concept. No matter how hard he tried, Elena was quiet for a long moment. And Kirith watched her face change in subtle ways that he was slowly starting to understand. Meant she was thinking carefully about her answer. "Let me tell you a story," she said finally. "About my grandfather." Kirith nodded, because stories were something he understood. And he took another sip of water while he waited for her to continue. "My grandfather grew up on Earth," Elena said. "That is the human homeworld, in case you did not know. A little blue planet covered in water. So much water that we actually dump it on ourselves for fun and call it swimming." Kirith tried to imagine a world with that much water and failed completely. "But he did not interrupt when my grandfather was young," Elena continued. There was a war, and he lost everything. His home, his family, his food, everything. And he was starving on the streets of a ruined city with no hope and no future. Her voice had gone soft and distant, like she was seeing something far away that Kirith could not see. One day a woman found him, Elena said. A stranger he had never met before, and she gave him a piece of bread, which was all she had left in the world. What did she ask for in return? Kirith asked. Because that was the obvious question. Nothing, Elena said. And she smiled again with that strange showing of teeth. She did not want anything from him. She just saw a starving child and gave him food, because that is what you do when you see someone suffering. Kirith felt his confusion growing deeper instead of lighter. But how did your grandfather repay her? He asked. He must have found her later and given her something of equal value. That is how debts work. Elena shook her head. He never saw her again, she said. He looked for her after the war ended, but he never found her. And he never got the chance to pay her back. Then the debt remains unpaid, Kirith said. And the thought of an open debt like that made him deeply uncomfortable. That is a terrible thing to live with. An obligation that can never be fulfilled. That is where you are wrong, Elena said. And she leaned forward slightly like she was about to share a secret. Because the woman told my grandfather something before she left. Something that changed the way he thought about debts forever. What did she say? Kirith asked. And he was surprised to find that he genuinely wanted to know. She told him not to try to pay her back, Elena said. She told him that when he got back on his feet and his life was good again, he should find someone else who needed help and help them instead. Kirith frowned, his brow ridges drawing together as he tried to process this. But that does not cancel the debt, he said. Helping someone else does not repay the person who helped you. That is the point. Elena said, the debt is not supposed to be canceled. It is supposed to be passed on. My grandfather helped someone else, and he told them to do the same, and they helped someone else. And that person helped someone else, and on forever. An unending debt, Kirith said slowly. And the concept was so alien to everything he had ever been taught that he could barely wrap his mind around it. A debt that is owed to no one and everyone at the same time. Exactly, Elena said. And she was smiling that teeth-showing smile again. Humans call it paying it forward. You cannot always help the person who helped you, but you can help someone else. And that keeps the kindness moving through the world like a wave that never stops. Kirith looked down at the canteen in his hands, at the water that was keeping him alive. And he thought about what Elena had said. It made no logical sense, not really. Because an unending debt was not a debt at all by any proper accounting. But somehow it also made more sense than anything he had ever heard. Your species is very strange, he said. Finally, Elena laughed, which was a sound that Kirith was learning meant happiness rather than threat. Yeah, she said. We really are. She stood up and brushed the dust off her suit and held out a hand to help him to his feet. Come on, kid, she said. We have a long walk ahead of us, and we should get moving before the suns get any higher. Kirith took her hand and let her pull him up. And as they started walking together across the burning wasteland, he thought about debts and kindness and waves that never stopped. He was beginning to understand why the elders spoke of humans with such unease. It was not because they were dangerous, though they certainly were. That it was because they were unpredictable in ways that could change everything you thought you knew about the universe, and that was far more terrifying than any weapon could ever be. They walked through the rest of that brutal day, resting in whatever shade they could find during the worst of the heat. And when the twin suns finally began to sink below the horizon and the temperature dropped to something almost bearable, they picked up their pace and kept moving. Elena had insisted that Kirith drink most of the remaining water, saying that she was used to operating on minimal resources and that dragon children probably needed more hydration than stubborn, Human Sergeant Skyreth had tried to argue, but he had quickly learned that arguing with Elena was like trying to argue with a mountain. And mountains did not change their minds just because you asked nicely as they walked through the cooling night. Elena told him stories to keep his mind off the pain in his legs and the fear in his heart. And Kirith found himself listening with a fascination that surprised him. She told him about Earth, the human homeworld, a planet so covered in water that entire regions of it were nothing but liquid from horizon to horizon. We call them oceans, Elena said, her boots crunching steadily over the volcanic glass as they walked. And they are so deep in some places that we have not even explored the bottom yet. Even after thousands of years of trying, Kirith tried to imagine what it would be like to live on a world with that much water, where you could just walk to a river or a lake and drink whenever you wanted without worrying about payment or trade. The thought was almost too beautiful to bear. Elena told him about human wars, which were apparently something her species engaged in with alarming frequency, fighting each other over territory and resources and ideas, and sometimes just because they were angry and needed something to hit. We are very good at being angry, Elena admitted with a laugh. It is not our best quality, but it has helped us survive some things that probably should have killed us. She told him about human music, and human art, and human food, and the way humans formed families that were not always based on blood and biology, but sometimes just on love and choice and the decision to care about someone else. My best friend is a woman I met in basic training, Elena said. We are not related at all, not even a little bit. But I would die for her without hesitation, and she would do the same for me. Why? Kirith asked. Because that was the question he kept coming back to. Why would you die for someone you are not related to? Someone who is not part of your clan or your family line. Elena was quiet for a moment, and Kirith could see her thinking in the dim light of the stars. Because love is not a transaction, she said finally. At least not for humans. You do not love someone because you expect to get something back. You love them because they exist and because they matter to you and because the universe is better with them in it. That makes no sense, Kirith said. But even as the words left his mouth, he was not sure he believed them anymore. I know, Elena said. And she reached over and ruffled the scales on top of his head in a way that should have been annoying but was actually kind of nice. Humans are very bad at making sense. We run on feelings more than logic most of the time. As the night wore on and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, Kirith felt his legs beginning to fail him again. Despite the water he had drunk and the rest he had taken, he tried to hide it. Tried to keep walking like everything was fine. But Elena noticed almost immediately, because apparently stubborn human sergeants were also very observant. Okay, she said, stopping and kneeling down in front of him. Climb on. Kirith stared at her in confusion. What? Climb on my back, Elena said, turning around and patting her shoulders. You are too tired to walk, and I am not leaving you behind. So we are doing this the old-fashioned way. I'm too heavy, Kirith protested. I will slow you down. Kid, I once carried my squad leader through 12 kilometers of jungle after he got his leg blown off by a landmine, Elena said. You weigh about half what he did, and you are not bleeding everywhere. So climb on and stop arguing. Kirith wanted to protest more, wanted to insist that he could make it on his own. But his legs were shaking so badly that he could barely stand. And he knew she was right, so he climbed onto her back and wrapped his arms around her neck and let her carry him through the darkness. Like he was a hatchling being carried by his mother. It should have been humiliating, being carried like a child by a member of another species. But somehow it was not humiliating at all. It was warm and safe and kind. And Kirith had not felt any of those things since the slavers had come and taken everything away. Tell me more about paying it forward, he said quietly. his voice muffled against her shoulder. "Tell me more about how the debt works." Elena adjusted her grip on his legs and kept walking, her pace steady and strong despite the extra weight she was carrying. "My grandfather passed the debt to 7 people before he died," she said. 7 strangers he helped over the course of his life, asking nothing in return except that they do the same for someone else. "Did they?" Kirith asked. "Most of them did," Elena said. "And the ones they helped probably helped others too, and those people helped others, until nobody could count anymore how many lives had been touched by one piece of bread given to a starving child." Kirith thought about that, about how one small act of kindness could ripple outward through time and space until it became something enormous and unstoppable. "It is like a wave," he said softly. "Exactly like a wave," Elena agreed. "And the beautiful thing about waves is that they do not stop just because you want them to. They keep going and going until they wash over everything." "But what if someone breaks the chain?" Kirith asked. "What if someone takes the help and never passes it on? Does that not end the debt?" "Sometimes," Elena admitted. "Sometimes people take and never give, and the chain breaks, and the wave stops." She paused and looked back at him over her shoulder. "But here is the thing," she said. "There are always other chains, other waves, other acts of kindness starting somewhere else, and as long as some of them keep going, the whole thing keeps working." "That seems like a very uncertain system," Kirith said. "Based more on hope than on contracts." "It is," Elena said. And she laughed softly. "Humans are very big on hope. Probably because we spent so long being small and weak and having nothing else to rely on." They walked in silence for a while after that, and Kirith felt his eyes growing heavy as the rhythm of Elena's footsteps lulled him towards sleep just before he drifted off. He heard Elena speak one more time. "When this is over," she said quietly, "when you are safe and back with your people, you do not owe me anything. Do you understand? But the debt." Kirith mumbled sleepily. "Forget the debt," Elena said. "Or rather, remember it differently. Remember that someone helped you when you needed it. And someday when you see someone else who needs help, you help them. That is all I ask." Kirith wanted to argue, wanted to explain that this was not how debts worked and that there had to be something he could give her in return. But sleep was pulling him down like a warm tide. The last thing he felt before unconsciousness took him was the steady movement of Elena's steps carrying him towards safety. And the last thing he heard was her voice humming a soft melody that he did not recognize, but that made him feel like maybe everything was going to be okay. When morning came and the garrison appeared on the horizon, Kirith was still on her back, and Elena was still walking, and her lips were cracked and dry from the water she had refused to take back, but she was smiling that teeth-showing smile of hers, and she did not seem to regret anything at all. 40 years had passed since that day in the Ember Wastes, and Kirith was no longer a frightened child dying of thirst on the burning rocks. He was Ambassador Kirith of the Dreg-3 hegemony now, one of the most respected diplomats in the known galaxy, with scales that shimmered like sapphires in the light of 100 different suns and a voice that could command silence in the loudest chambers. He had earned his position through decades of careful work and patient negotiation, building bridges between species that had never trusted each other before, and finding solutions to problems that everyone else had declared impossible. But no matter how high he rose or how much power he accumulated, he never forgot the human woman who had given him her canteen in the desert. And he never stopped looking for ways to pass on what she had given him. He had helped 17 people over the years, 17 strangers who had needed something he could provide. And he had asked nothing from any of them except that they remember the kindness and share it with someone else. When the time came, 17 waves sent out into the universe. 17 debts that could never be repaid, except by being passed on forever. But today, standing in the great chamber of the Galactic Council. Kirith knew that all of those small acts of kindness had been leading to something bigger, something that would dwarf everything that came before. The council chamber was enormous, a vast circular space that could hold representatives from all 300 member species of the galactic community. And today, every single seat was filled. The air was thick with tension and the sharp scent of fear that Kirith's sensitive nostrils could detect even from his position at the speaker's podium. The topic of discussion was humanity. Specifically, the fact that humanity was dying. The frontier wars had ended 3 years ago. A brutal conflict that had pitted the human colonies against a coalition of species who had decided that the young upstart race needed to be taught its place in the galactic order. Humanity had won, barely, through the same stubborn refusal to die that had carried them to the stars in the first place. But the victory had come at a terrible cost. 17 of their colony worlds had been ravaged, their infrastructure destroyed, their food production facilities reduced to rubble. And now millions of human beings were facing starvation because there simply was not enough food to go around. Humanity had asked the Galactic Council for aid, a request that should have been simple enough given the wealth and resources available to the combined member species. But nothing was ever simple in politics. And there were those who saw an opportunity in humanity's suffering. They brought this upon themselves, the Velith delegate was saying, his multiple eyes blinking in sequence as he addressed the chamber. Their aggressive expansion and refusal to respect established boundaries led directly to the conflict that has brought them to this state. He spread his manipulator arms in a gesture that was meant to look sympathetic but came across as smug to anyone who knew how to read Velith body language. It is not our responsibility to rescue them from the consequences of their own recklessness, he continued. Let them learn humility. Let them understand that the galaxy does not bend to the will of any single species, no matter how stubbornly they cling to their own survival. There were murmurs of agreement from around the chamber, and Kirith felt his fire glands warming with anger that he had to work hard to suppress. He knew what this was really about, and it had nothing to do with teaching humanity a lesson the Velith and their allies were afraid of what humanity might become if it was allowed to recover and grow stronger, afraid of a species that had already proven it could not be easily defeated. They wanted to let humanity starve not because it was just or right, but because it was convenient, because a weakened humanity was a humanity that could be controlled and contained. Kirith thought about Elena, about the woman who had given her water to a dying dragon child without asking for anything in return. He thought about her grandfather, about the stranger who had shared her bread with a starving boy in the ruins of a war-torn city. He thought about 17 acts of kindness spreading out through the years like waves that never stopped, touching lives that could never be counted. And he thought about what Elena had told him on that long walk through the desert, about how humans were good at hope because they had spent so long having nothing else to rely on. He rose from his seat, and the chamber fell silent because when Ambassador Kirith of the Drakthari hegemony wanted to speak, people listened. 40 years ago, he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the great chamber. I was a child dying of thirst in the ember wastes of Kirith Prime. He paused and let his gaze sweep across the assembled delegates, making sure they were paying attention. I had been walking for days without water, he continued. My scales were cracked and gray. My fire glands had gone cold, and I was certain that I was going to die alone in that burning hellscape without ever seeing my family again. The chamber was absolutely silent now. Every eye and sensor and receptor focused on him. And then a human found me, Kirith said, a young soldier named Elena Vasquez, who was conducting a survey mission in the area and happened to pick up my life signs on her scanner. He paused again, letting the tension build. I begged her for water, he said. I told her I would pay anything, that my clan would reward her generously if she just gave me one sip to keep me alive long enough to reach safety. One sip, he repeated, letting the words hang in the air. That was all I asked for. One tiny sip from her canteen. He spread his claws wide in a gesture that encompassed the entire chamber. She gave me the entire canteen, he said. Every drop of water she had, knowing full well that it might mean her own death in that desert. There were murmurs of surprise from around the chamber, and Kirith waited for them to die down before continuing. When I asked her why she would do such a thing, he said, she told me something that changed my understanding of the universe forever. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering Elena's face in the harsh light of the ember wastes, remembering her teeth-showing smile that had seemed so strange at first and so beautiful by the end. She said, because you needed it, and because I can help. He opened his eyes and looked directly at the Velith delegate, who had the decency to look uncomfortable under his gaze. That is what humans are, Kirith said. Not the aggressive conquerors you want to paint them as. Not the dangerous threat you claim they represent. But a species that will give everything they have to help a stranger, simply because the stranger needs help and they have something to give. He turned to address the full chamber again. 17 human colonies are facing starvation right now, he said. Millions of human beings, including children like the child I once was, are going to die unless we help them. He let that sink in for a moment. We have the resources, he said. We have the ships and the food and the medicine and everything else they need. The only question is whether we have the will to use them. He drew himself up to his full height, his scales catching the light and throwing rainbow patterns across the nearest delegates. The Drake Theory hegemony pledges 300 cargo vessels of emergency supplies, he announced, effective immediately, with no conditions and no expectation of repayment. The chamber erupted in shocked whispers, and Kirith raised a claw for silence. I invite the other member species to join us, he said. Not because humanity has earned our help, not because they can pay us back, but because they need it and because we can provide it. He paused and let his voice drop to something softer, something more personal. A wise human once told me that mercy is not a transaction, he said. It is a wave that keeps moving through the universe, touching lives and changing hearts long after the original act of kindness has been forgotten. He looked around the chamber one final time. Today, I am passing on a debt that was given to me 40 years ago in a burning desert, he said. And I am asking all of you to join me, not because it makes political sense or because it will benefit your species in some calculable way, but because it is the right thing to do. He sat down, and for a long moment there was silence. Then the Carathian delegate rose and pledged 50 medical ships. Then the Orion delegate pledged 100,000 tons of grain. Then another delegate, and another, until the pledges were coming so fast that the recording secretary could barely keep up. The vote passed with an overwhelming majority, and humanity would not starve afterward. When the chamber was clearing and delegates were already rushing to their communication devices to arrange the promised aid, a young human aide approached Kirith with tears streaming down her face. Ambassador, she said, her voice choked with emotion, I do not know how to thank you. I do not know how any of us could ever repay what you have done today. Kirith thought about Elena, about the canteen, about the long walk through the desert with a dying child on her back. He thought about her grandfather, about the bread, about the stranger who had asked for nothing except that the kindness be passed on. He smiled, showing his teeth in the human way that Elena had taught him all those years ago. Find someone who needs help, he said gently, and help them. That is how your people taught me to settle a debt. The young woman stared at him for a moment, and then her face changed.